You're an Iraqi MiG-23 pilot in 1982, cruising at 30,000 feet over the Iran-Iraq border. The steady thrum of your twin engines is almost meditative. Below, the desert stretches endlessly, a sea of sand and dust. You've trained for years on Soviet equipment, know every switch, every gauge, every quirk of this machine. Your mission is straightforward: intercept Iranian strike packages heading into Iraqi airspace. Then, without warning, your radar warning receiver screams to life. Not a chirp, not a beep. A full-throated, bone-chilling wail that makes your blood run cold. Your hand instinctively tightens on the stick. That distinctive tone, the one from nightmare briefings, the one that makes veteran pilots go pale, tells you something is hunting you from an impossible distance. Your radar operator frantically scans his scope, voice tight with tension. Contact. Bearing 035 range. Over 100 miles. Your heart stops. This isn't supposed to happen. Soviet doctrine never prepared you for this. The enemy shouldn't even know you exist yet. But there it is on your instruments. Undeniable proof that somewhere far beyond visual range, an Iranian F-14 Tomcat has you in its crosshairs. Training kicks in. There's only one response. You slam the stick hard left, dropping altitude fast as your engines will carry you. Diving for the deck where ground clutter might save your life. Because if you hesitate even seconds, a massive AIM-54 Phoenix missile traveling at Mach 4 will turn your aircraft into a fireball. At that speed, it covers a football field every 10th of a second. You have maybe 90 seconds. Maybe. If you're fascinated by this technological chess match between cutting-edge American systems and well-trained pilots in Soviet aircraft, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps me continue bringing these deep dives into the tactics and technology that shaped modern air warfare. The Iran-Iraq War that raged from 1980 to 1988 became an unexpected proving ground for one of the most sophisticated weapon systems ever deployed. The Grumman F-14 Tomcat, paired with the Hughes AWG-9 radar and AIM-54 Phoenix missile. What makes this conflict particularly fascinating is that it pitted cutting-edge American technology against Soviet equipment in capable hands. The Iraqi Air Force wasn't flying obsolete junk. They operated MiG-21 Biz fighters with updated avionics, MiG-23ML floggers with look-down, shoot-down capability, and even the high-speed MiG-25 Foxbat interceptor. These were formidable machines. But when faced with the F-14 Tomcat, they encountered a technological chasm so vast, it fundamentally changed how Iraqi pilots approached air combatant survival itself. Here's what you need to understand. Iraqi pilots weren't cowards. They were professionals who flew combat missions throughout an 8-tier war. But the consistent pattern of F-14 dominance created something more powerful than physical destruction. It created psychological terror. And that terror began with numbers that tell a story beyond simple specifications. The AWG-9 radar system installed in Iran's F-14 Tomcats represented a generational leap in airborne radar technology. Not an incremental improvement, a fundamental reimagining of what fighter radar could accomplish. The AWG-9's planar array antenna measured 36 inches in diameter, significantly larger than anything in Soviet fighters of the era. And in radar technology, size isn't just everything, it's the only thing. That extra diameter meant detecting targets Iraqi pilots couldn't even dream of seeing. The system's peak output power reached 10.2 kilowatts, making it the most powerful fighter radar in operational service until the F-222's APG-77 entered service in 2005. Let that sink in. A 1970s radar system remained unmatched for 30 years. Here's the brutal math that Iraqi pilots faced. In pulse Doppler search mode, the AWG-9 could detect bomber-sized targets from 150 nautical miles away. That's 173 statute miles. For fighter-sized targets roughly equivalent to a MiG-21 or a MiG-23, detection range was 115 nautical miles. That's 132 statute miles. Now, compare that to what Iraqi pilots were working with. The MiG-21 Biz, backbone of Iraq's fighter force with 9 operational squadrons, carried the RP-22 Sapphire radar. Maximum detection range against fighters? Maybe 30 miles on a good day. The MiG-23ML's Sapphire 23ML radar looked better on paper at 5 kilometers theoretical range. But here's what the specs don't tell you. That's under perfect conditions against a non-maneuvering target with no countermeasures. In real combat, with targets maneuvering and employing even basic defensive tactics, effective range dropped to 35 miles or less. Picture the tactical situation. One F-14 at altitude. Its radar sweeps the sky and locks onto 24 different contacts to full squadrons of enemy fighters. The crew selects 6 priority threats. With a single command, 6 Phoenix missiles ripple off the rails, each hunting a different target. And those Iraqi pilots have no idea death is already in the air. By the time their radar warning receivers scream that they're being painted by fire control radar, they might have less than 60 seconds before impact. One Iraqi pilot, interviewed years after the war, described it this way: "It's like being hunted by a ghost. You know it's there. Your instruments scream at you. But you can't see it, can't fight it, can't even locate it precisely. You just run. And pray your engines are fast enough." That uncertainty, not knowing if the F-14 was 80 miles away or 40, proved psychologically devastating. The doctrinal response was immediate. Drop to low altitude where ground clutter might mask your signature. Deploy countermeasures and get out of the threat sector as fast as possible. But this defensive reaction meant the mission was already compromised. Strike packages couldn't continue to their targets. Combat air patrols were forced to abandon their sectors. The mere presence of F-14s achieved area denial without firing a shot. Now here's where it gets truly interesting. The weapon system that transformed this detection advantage into lethal capability, the AIM-5 for Phoenix, remains the longest-range air-to-air missile ever deployed operationally. Maximum range exceeding 100 nautical miles, distances where most fighters couldn't even detect targets. The missile's flight profile was brutally efficient. An initial boost phase where the solid fuel rocket motors screamed it to Mach 4, launch at maximum range, and it reached targets 80 miles away in under 2 minutes. That's not enough time to react, not enough time to run, barely enough time to pray. Iranian F-14 crews perfected their tactics, climbed to 35,000 to 40,000 feet, where thin air extends missile range. From this altitude, the AWG-9 has an unobstructed view of the airspace below. When Phoenix missiles launch, they convert altitude into additional kinetic energy, diving onto targets below with devastating effect. But here's the technical detail that truly outclassed Iraqi capabilities. The Phoenix's terminal guidance phase used active radar homing. The missile's own onboard radar took over for the final approach. Once it went active, usually within the final 10 to 20 miles the launching, F-14 could break lock and maneuver defensively. The missile hunted autonomously. Iraqi pilots never had this capability. The R-60 Aphid and R-13 missiles they carried required continuous infrared tracking throughout the engagement, against an adversary employing even basic countermeasures. Maintaining that lock proved incredibly difficult and forced Iraqi pilots into vulnerable tail chase positions. According to exhaustive research by Tom Cooper and Farzad Bishop, who conducted extensive interviews with Iranian pilots and reviewed operational records, Iranian F-14 Tomcats firing AIM-5 for Phoenix missiles achieved 78 confirmed victories during the Iran-Iraq War. These kills included MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-25s, Tu-22 bombers, Su-20 and Su-22 fighter bombers, and French-built Mirage F-1s. The research even documents instances where Phoenix missiles successfully engaged and destroyed incoming anti-ship missiles, specifically to AIM-39, exocets, and one C-600R1 cruise missile. Think about what that means. Iranian F-14 crews were engaging cruise missiles, targets with minimal radar cross-sections traveling at high subsonic speeds, and successfully destroying them. If they could hit those, conventional fighters presented relatively easy targets. Now, I need to address something important. Some sources claim the Phoenix's combat record was exaggerated, that many kills attributed to it were actually scored by AIM-7 Sparrows or AIM-9 Sidewinders. There's validity to this skepticism. Combat kill attribution is notoriously difficult, especially when both sides have propaganda incentives. Western intelligence initially estimated roughly 35 to 45 kills throughout the war, with perhaps 12 F-14 losses. But here's what doesn't lie. Iraqi Air Force tactical documents captured after the 2003 invasion. These weren't propaganda pieces. They were internal training documents repeatedly referencing F-14 Tomcats as a priority threat. detailing specific procedures for dealing with suspected Tomcat activity. These were hard-learned lessons written in blood by pilots who didn't react fast enough when they heard that a WG-9 tone. Let me show you what this looked like in practice. November 1982, an Iraqi strike package for MiG-23B. Fighter bombers with an escort of 4 MiG-21 interceptors approaches Iranian oil infrastructure on Karg Island, high-value target. The mission was carefully planned. Strike aircraft at low altitude to avoid radar detection. Up for weapons release, then egress at high speed. The MiG-21 escorts orbiting at medium altitude, roughly 20,000 feet, ready to engage Iranian interceptors. At this point in the war, Iraqi pilots had developed effective tactics for dealing with Iranian F-4 Phantoms and F-5 Tigers. Dangerous adversaries, but they could engage them on relatively equal terms. What they didn't know. 2 Iranian F-14As from Tactical Fighter Base 8 at Isfahan were already airborne, conducting combat air patrol at 38,000 feet, roughly 70 miles from Karg Island. The Tomcat crew's new Iraqi attack packages were hitting oil facilities with increasing frequency. Their mission was straightforward: prevent any strikes from reaching their targets. At 0815 hours local time, the lead F-14's radar intercept officer detected multiple contacts. The AWG-9's automatic target tracking quickly sorted the returns, 8 distinct targets. It's probably a strike package with escorts based on formation geometry. Range, 96 nautical miles. The RIO designated the 4 high-altitude contacts, the MiG-21 escorts, as primary threats. The AWG-9 locked them up in track-while scan mode. The RIO began preparing Phoenix missiles for employment. Here's where the technical advantages became absolutely overwhelming. The Iraqi pilots had no idea they were being tracked. Their radars couldn't detect targets at that range. Their radar warning receivers weren't picking up the AWG-9's emissions at that distance and aspect angle. Signal strength wasn't strong enough to trip their threat warning systems. They were flying into a trap they couldn't see. The lead F-14 crew followed standard doctrine: verify track data, confirm hostile classification, call for clearance to engage. Command authorization came back quickly, cleared to fire. The lead Tomcat ripple-fired to AIM-54A. Phoenix missiles targeting the leading pair of MiG-21s. Launch sequence complete. Missiles away. The AWG-9 continued tracking all targets while guiding the outbound weapons. Now the Iraqi situation deteriorated catastrophically. Approximately 30 seconds after launch, when the Phoenix missiles were already at Mach 3, covering ground at nearly a mile per second, the Iraqi pilots' radar warning receivers suddenly exploded with threat warnings. That distinctive AWG-9 tone told them everything they needed to know and nothing they wanted to hear. F-14 Tomcats were engaging them from beyond visual range. Iraqi tactical doctrine was crystal clear. When you detect F-1 for radar emissions, you disengage immediately. Don't try to fight. Don't try to complete the mission. Get out. But by the time the radar warning receivers detected the threat, it was already too late for 2 of the MiG-21 pilots. The Phoenix missiles were in terminal guidance, their own active radar seekers locked onto their targets. The first Phoenix detonated its 60-kilogram warhead within lethal radius of the lead, Mach-1. The massive blast fragmentation pattern shredded the aircraft's control surfaces and engine section. The pilot didn't have time to eject. The second Phoenix, tracking the wingman, detonated seconds later with similar results. The remaining 6 Iraqi aircraft immediately broke formation and dove for the deck. Attempting to mask themselves in ground clutter and break radar locks they couldn't even confirm existed. The strike mission was aborted. For fighter bombers full of ordnance, tanked up with fuel for a long-range penetration, jettisoned their weapons and fled Iraqi airspace. The Iranian F-14s didn't even pursue. They didn't need to. Mission accomplished. Threat eliminated. Area denied. This scenario repeated itself dozens of times throughout the war. Iraqi strike packages would approach Iranian targets. F-14s would engage them from beyond their ability to respond effectively. The Iraqis withdrew, even when Tomcats didn't fire missiles. It's just the knowledge that F-14s were operating in the area was often sufficient to abort Iraqi missions. But here's something that might surprise you. The F-14 wasn't invincible. Iranian F-14s suffered losses too. The exact number remains disputed. Western sources estimate 12 combat losses throughout the 8-year war. Iranian sources claim 6 to 8. What's significant? Very few came from air-to-air combat. Only 2 F-14s were confirmed shot down by Iraqi fighters. One fell to a MiG in December 1980 war, appears to have been a fortunate shot during a close-range engagement. Another was destroyed by a MiG to 3 ml in August 1984, using an R-60 infrared missile. The circumstances are revealing because it demonstrates the only reliable way. Iraqi pilots found to engage F-14s successfully. Don't try to fight them at beyond visual range where they hold every advantage. Instead, wait for opportunities when Tomcats are engaged with other threats, distracted, or at low altitude and low speed where their energy advantage disappears. Come in from the side or rear with infrared missiles. Get a quick shot. Disengage before the Tomcat crew can respond. This tactic required patience, perfect timing, and considerable luck. But it was the only method that worked. The majority of Iranian F-14 losses came from surface-to-air missiles particularly. Iraqi SA-2 and SA-6 systems and from operational accidents. And this last category reveals something crucial about Iran's situation. After the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the United States imposed a complete arms embargo on Iran. No spare parts. No replacement missiles. Nothing. The Iranian Air Force had to keep these incredibly complex aircraft flying through improvisation, cannibalization, and creative black market procurement. The F-14 Tomcat was one of the most complex aircraft ever deployed to carrier operations. Variable geometry wings with sophisticated control systems. 2 afterburning turbofan engines. Advanced radar requiring specialized test equipment. Weapon systems needing constant calibration. Keeping these aircraft operational required not just spare parts, but also technical knowledge, specialized tools, and in some cases, unique test equipment that could only be obtained from the United States. Iranian maintainers performed miracles. When electronic components failed and replacements weren't available, technicians learned to harvest parts from less critical systems and adapt them for essential functions. They reverse-engineered components they couldn't acquire and developed indigenous manufacturing capability for critical parts. The ingenuity displayed included some truly creative solutions that would have impressed any engineering team working under normal conditions, let alone wartime constraints, with no external support. The Iranian Air Force established a formal cannibalization programs, a certain aircraft designated as parts donors, systematically stripped of useful components to keep other aircraft flying. This wasn't ideal, but it was necessary. By mid-war, Iran might have 30 F-14 airframes on base, but only 15 to 20 actually capable of flying combat missions. By late war, 1984, 1985 timeframe. Iran could rarely keep more than 20 to 25 F-14s operationally ready at any given time out of the 79 originally delivered. Maintenance crews performed miracles just keeping the existing fleet flying. When you consider that modern air forces with full supply chains and manufacturer support struggle to maintain 70 to 80% readiness rates, what Iranian maintainers achieved under embargo conditions borders on the impossible. The fact that these aircraft continued to dominate Iraqi airspace despite these crippling logistical constraints speaks to both the capability of the platform and the skill of Iranian maintainers and pilots. Let me draw some comparisons to put the F-14's advantage in perspective, because understanding these differences helps explain why Iraqi pilots reacted with such terror. When they detected F-1 for radar emissions, consider the F-15 Eagle, which entered service around the same time as the Tomcat. Many consider it the finest air superiority fighter of the late Cold War, and for good reason. Both aircraft represented the pinnacle of American fighter design in their era. The F-15's APG-S63 radar was excellent, one of the best fighter radars of its generation, providing solid detection range and effective weapons guidance. In look-down mode against fighter targets, it could detect and track contacts at roughly 50 to 60 nautical miles. That's impressive performance. It gave F-15 pilots a significant advantage over most adversaries they might face. But compare that to the AWG-9's 115 nautical mile detection range against the same target class. The F-14 could engage targets at nearly twice the distance the F-15 could even detect them. The F-15 also had superior sustained turn performance compared to the F-14 and arguably better overall dogfighting characteristics. In a visual range engagement, A skilled F-15 pilot could probably defeat an F-14 more often than not. But in the fleet defense role that the Tomcat was designed for, the F-14 with its AWG-9 radar and Phoenix missiles was simply without peer. No other Western fighter could engage 6 targets simultaneously at extreme range. Now extend that comparison to Soviet fourth-generation fighters like the MiG-29, the MiG-29 ASN-019 radar, which didn't enter service until the mid-1980s after most of the Iran-Iraq War was over, could detect fighter targets at approximately 50 nautical miles. Again, solid performance for its era, representing a genuine leap forward in Soviet fighter radar capability. Had still less than half the detection range of the AWG-9 system that had been operational since the mid-1970s. The Soviet MiG-31 Foxhound, which entered service in 1981, represents the closest Soviet analog to the F-14's long-range intercept capability. The MiG-31 featured the powerful Zaslan radar, capable of detecting targets at approximately 110 to 120 miles and tracking multiple targets simultaneously. The MiG-31 carried the R-33 long-range missile with a stated range exceeding 100 kilometers. On paper, this looked like a system that could match the F-14 in beyond visual range combat. But the MiG-31 was designed as a pure interceptor, optimized for shooting down bombers and cruise missiles threatening the Soviet Union's vast northern territories. It lacked the agility for air-to-air combat against fighter aircraft. More importantly for our story, Iraq never received MiG-31s, so they never appeared in the Iran-Iraq conflict. Iraqi pilots had to face F-14s with much less capable aircraft. This technological advantage created what military analysts call an asymmetric engagement envelope. Iraqi pilots fighting Iranian F-14s weren't engaging in traditional fighter versus fighter combat where both sides maneuver for advantage. We're trying to survive in an environment where the enemy could see them long before they could respond, could engage them at distances where evasion was nearly impossible, could disengage at will if the tactical situation turned against them. This is the kind of advantage that doesn't just affect individual engagements, it shapes entire campaign strategies. The Iraqi Air Force essentially ceded large portions of Iranian airspace to F-14 patrols. They couldn't effectively operate where Tomcats were known to be active. This limited their ability to conduct deep strikes against Iranian infrastructure, restricted their ability to intercept Iranian strike packages, and forced them to allocate disproportionate air defense resources to sectors where F-14s might appear. One aspect of the F-14 threat that doesn't get discussed enough, how it affected Iraqi pilot morale and training. When you're training new fighter pilots, you want to build confidence in aggressive tactics. You want pilots who will press attacks and take calculated risks. You want to develop the kind of offensive mindset that wins air battles. But when facing F-14s, Iraqi doctrine required the exact opposite behavior. Defensive reactions, immediate disengagement, prioritizing survival over mission completion. This created a contradictory training environment that undermined the very foundations of fighter pilot development. Iraqi fighter instructors had to teach their students to be aggressive, offensive-minded fighter pilots while simultaneously drilling into them that if they even suspected an F-14 was in the area, their only correct response was to run away. Think about the psychological impact of that contradiction. Young pilots learning their trade are told to be brave, to press the attack, to trust their training and their aircraft. Then they're told that against one specific threat, the F-14, all of that goes out the window. Run. Don't fight. Just survive. That kind of doctrine doesn't build aggressive, confident fighter pilots. It breeds caution and hesitation qualities that can get you killed in air combat against other threats. It creates a mental barrier that's hard to overcome, even when facing adversaries you could defeat. Iraqi pilots who successfully engaged Iranian F-4 Phantoms or F-5 Tigers still carried that F-1 for fear with them, and it affected how they approached every engagement. The human factors dimension of this technological disparity created effects that are harder to quantify, but equally important. Stress affects pilot performance in measurable ways. When you know you're operating against a superior threat, your cognitive load increases. You're not just flying your aircraft and executing tactics. You're also constantly scanning for that specific threat signature. That AWG-9 tone? That means you're seconds away from death. Iraqi fighter pilots flying missions in areas where F-14s might be present operated under continuous stress. This affected everything from their fuel management decisions to their willingness to press attacks against other Iranian aircraft. Even when F-14s weren't present, the possibility that they might be affected Iraqi decision-making. Strike packages would abort missions based on uncertain intelligence that F-14s might be in the area. Combat air patrols would withdraw from their assigned sectors prematurely because a single ambiguous radar contact might be a Tomcat. Iranian F-14 crews certainly experienced stress too. But their stress came from different sources, primarily concerns about mechanical reliability rather than fear of technologically superior adversaries. An Iranian F-14 crew had to worry about whether their radar would work properly, whether their missiles would guide correctly, or whether their aircraft would make it back to base. But they didn't have to worry about being hunted by something they couldn't see or fight. That psychological advantage proved as valuable as the technical one. The Iraqi Air Force did develop some counter-tactics that showed promise, though none proved consistently effective against the F-14 threat. They began employing MiG-25 Foxbats in high-speed reconnaissance roles, using the aircraft's Mach 2.83 capability to blast through Iranian airspace before F-14s could intercept effectively. The Foxbat's speed advantage meant it could sometimes outrun Phoenix missiles, though this required perfect execution and advanced warning of the threat. The tactic worked best when MiG-25 pilots maintained maximum speed throughout their penetration, never slowing down even for their reconnaissance tasks. But this limited the quality of intelligence they could gather. Iraqi attempts to counter the F-14 threat evolved throughout the war as they accumulated hard-won experience. One approach involved trying to saturate Iranian air defenses through sheer numbers. If you could force the defending F-14s to engage multiple raid packages simultaneously from different directions, perhaps you could overwhelm their capability to track and engage all threats. This tactic showed occasional success, particularly in 1986-87, when Iranian F-14 availability had declined due to maintenance issues, but it required carefully coordinated operations that pushed Iraqi command and control capabilities to their limits. Another Iraqi approach involved using electronic warfare aircraft to jam Iranian radars and communications. Iraq had acquired several Soviet-built electronic warfare platforms and developed indigenous jamming capabilities. The effectiveness of these systems against the AWG-9 appears to have been limited. The AWG-9 incorporated sophisticated countermeasures, including frequency agility that allowed it to hop between multiple operating frequencies if it detected jamming. Iraqi electronic warfare efforts probably degraded Iranian radar effectiveness to some degree, but they never came close to neutralizing the F-14 threat. Iraqi pilots also learned to exploit the F-14's weaknesses. And yes, despite its overwhelming advantages, the Tomcat had weaknesses. The aircraft's large size and weight meant it lost energy quickly in turning engagements. If Iraqi pilots could somehow force a close-range dogfight, the F-14's advantage diminished significantly. MiG-23s could outturn Tomcats at certain speed ranges. MiG-21s were even more agile in close combat. But getting to that close-range engagement without being shot down first proved incredibly difficult. The psychological impact on Iraqi pilots cannot be overstated. They weren't just fighting superior technology, they were fighting the fear that technology created. By late 1987 and into 1988, Iranian F-14 operations had declined significantly due to spare parts shortages. Phoenix missile stockpiles were critically low statements, suggest Iran had fewer than 50 operational AIM-54s remaining. The thermal batteries required for Phoenix operation, which had to be replaced regularly, were nearly impossible to acquire. Iran found clandestine buyers who supplied batteries at exorbitant prices, reportedly up to $10,000 each. But these procurement efforts couldn't keep pace with operational demands. Iranian F-14 crews increasingly flew missions armed primarily with AIM-7 Sparrows and AIM-9 Sidewinders, relying on the AWG-9's ability to guide Sparrows to medium range. Even without the Phoenix, the Tomcat remained a formidable threat. The radar advantage alone forced Iraqi pilots into defensive postures. Here's what this conflict revealed about modern air warfare truths that remain relevant today. First, sensor capability trumps kinematic performance in beyond visual range combat. Iraqi MiG 2-3 MLS could fly faster and higher than F-1 for Tomcats in certain flight regimes. On paper, they were credible threats. But when one side can see and shoot first from distances, the other side can't even detect. Traditional performance metrics become irrelevant. Second, weapons range creates tactical flexibility. The side that can engage first has more options for employment. It can dictate engagement, geometry, and can disengage if the situation becomes unfavorable. Third, technological advantages have multiplicative effects. A 20% advantage in detection range combined with a 30% advantage in missile range doesn't create a 50% combat advantage. It creates something closer to a 200% advantage because the advantages compound across the engagement timeline. Fourth, psychological effects of technological superiority can equal or exceed direct physical effects. When your adversary won't fight in areas where you operate because they know they can't win, you've achieved effective area denial without firing a shot. This lesson shaped fighter design for the next 3 decades. Every modern fighter emphasizes radar capability, sensor fusion, and beyond visual range weapons as primary design requirements. The F-2 to F-35, latest variants of the Eurofighter and Rafale follow the doctrine established by the F-14 in the Iran-Iraq War: see first, shoot first, maintain standoff range. Everything you're seeing in Ukraine right now, the emphasis on long-range missiles, electronic warfare, standoff weapons traces back to these skies over Iran and Iraq. The F-14 was the blueprint. Modern aircraft like the F-35 and Su-57, they're just refining the formula. The USAF's F-2 Raptor, designed in the 1990s and entering service in 2005, took the F-14's beyond visual range philosophy and extended it dramatically. The F-22 combines stealth technology with extremely powerful radar and long-range missiles to create an aircraft that could engage adversaries who literally couldn't detect its presence. The F-35 Lightning II followed similar principles, optimizing for sensor fusion, situational awareness, and first-look, first-shot capability. Russian designers developed the Su-35 and Su-57 with powerful radars and very long range, R-37M missiles specifically to compete in beyond visual range engagements. Chinese designers building the J-20 made similar design choices. Every major fifth-generation fighter program reflects lessons that trace back to how F-14s dominated Iraqi MiGs through superior sensors and weapons. Let me elaborate on the technical evolution that made the AWG-9 so dominant, because understanding this context explains why no other radar system of its era came close to matching its performance. The AWG-9 traced its lineage back to the failed F-111B program in the 1960s. The Navy had originally attempted to adapt the Air Force's F-111 tactical bomber into a fleet defense interceptor. The aircraft proved too heavy and underpowered for carrier operations. But weapon system development continued independently. Hughes Aircraft Company's Radar Systems Group in Los Angeles had invested nearly a decade refining the AWG-9 by the time the F-14 program began. This extended development period gave them opportunities to incorporate advancing solid-state electronics technology that simply wasn't available to Soviet designers working on contemporary systems. The extended timeline proved crucial. While Soviet designers were working under pressure to field new systems quickly to keep pace with perceived Western threats, Hughes engineers had the luxury of iterative refinement. They could test concepts, identify weaknesses, and redesign components over multiple development cycles. This process created a radar system that represented the accumulated knowledge of American radar engineering from World War II through the early 1970s. The Soviet Union's radar development followed a different trajectory, driven by different priorities. Their design philosophy emphasized simpler, more ruggedized systems that could be maintained in harsh field conditions with limited technical support. This approach had legitimate advantages in terms of reliability and ease of maintenance, particularly for an Air Force expected to operate from austere forward bases in wartime. But it imposed constraints on raw performance capability. The SAP-4 series radars used in MiG-23s utilized older vacuum tube technology in their transmitters well into the 1970s. Vacuum tubes are robust and can handle high power levels without the thermal management challenges of early solid-state components. They're also simple to replace, and the field technician with basic training can swap out a failed vacuum tube. But vacuum tubes are also bulky, power-hungry, and less capable of the rapid signal processing required for sophisticated pulse Doppler radar modes that could pick out fighter-sized targets against ground clutter. By contrast, the AWG-9 employed second-generation solid-state technology throughout its signal processing chain, including coherent transmitters and amplifiers that enabled the high pulse repetition, frequencies essential for detecting targets in ground clutter. This represented a fundamental shift in how radar systems processed information. The digital signal processing capabilities that seem routine today were cutting-edge technology in the early 1970s, and the AWG-9 pushed those boundaries aggressively. The antenna design differences reveal another fascinating aspect of their respective development approaches. The AWG-9's planar array antenna measured 36 inches in diameter. This large antenna provided excellent angular resolution and sensitivity. The antenna's physical size dictated much of the F-14's distinctive nose configuration, but it was non-negotiable for achieving required performance. Engineers knew that radar performance fundamentally depends on antenna size, and they designed the entire front end of the F-1 for around maximizing that antenna diameter within the constraints of carrier operations. Compare this to the MiG to 3ML's radar antenna, which measured approximately 27 inches in diameter. That 9-inch difference might not sound dramatic, but antenna gain increases with the square of the diameter. A larger antenna can detect weaker returns and maintain track at greater ranges. The relationship isn't linear, it's exponential. That extra 33% in diameter translated into detection range advantages that far exceeded 33%. The size disparity reflected fundamental design priorities. American designers optimized for maximum detection range and multi-target tracking capability, even if that required a larger, more expensive aircraft. The F-14 was designed to defend carrier battle groups against mass Soviet bomber attacks, a mission that demanded seeing threats as early as possible and engaging multiple targets simultaneously. Cost was a consideration, but capability came first. Soviet designers prioritized creating fighters that could be produced in large numbers, maintained in austere conditions, and operated by pilots with varying skill levels. The Soviet military doctrine assumed that in a major war, aircraft would be lost at high rates and needed rapid replacement. This meant designs had to be relatively simple to manufacture, use readily available materials, and minimize sophisticated components that might be difficult to produce in wartime. These were rational design choices given Soviet strategic assumptions and industrial capabilities. These design philosophies shaped not just the hardware, but operational doctrine. American F-14 doctrine assumed highly trained two-person crews working together with sophisticated automation to manage complex beyond visual range engagements. The radar intercept officer in the rear cockpit wasn't just a system operator, he was a tactical decision-maker whose judgment shaped the engagement. The division of labor between pilot and RIO allowed each to focus on their specialties. The pilot on flying the aircraft and maintaining tactical positioning, the RIO on managing the radar, analyzing threats, and directing weapons employment. Soviet doctrine for MiG-23s, particularly export versions supplied to Iraq, assumed much more limited crew capability and relied heavily on ground-controlled intercept guidance. Iraqi MiG-23 pilots received vectors from ground controllers who had better situational awareness through ground-based radar networks. The ground controllers could see the entire tactical picture, direct fighters to optimal intercept positions, and provide warning of threats the fighters themselves couldn't detect. This doctrine worked reasonably well in a defensive role protecting Iraqi airspace, where ground radars could provide cueing and controllers had good coverage. Iraqi air defense networks, built with Soviet assistance, featured comprehensive radar coverage over Iraqi territory. Controllers could vector fighters toward inbound Iranian aircraft, giving Iraqi pilots the information they lacked from their own radars. But this ground-controlled approach collapsed completely when Iraqi fighters tried to operate offensively in Iranian airspace, where they lacked that ground-based radar coverage, without controllers to provide vectors and early warning. Iraqi fighters had to rely solely on their aircraft's radar systems that were completely outmatched by what Iranian F-14s could do. It was like fighting with one eye covered and one hand tied behind their back. The difference in missile technology deserves deeper examination because weapons shape tactical options as much as radar systems do. The M54 Phoenix represented the culmination of long-range air-to-air missile development that began in the late 1950s. Its design incorporated inertial guidance during mid-course with command updates from the launching aircraft's radar. This meant the missile could fly an optimized trajectory toward the predicted intercept point without constant radar illumination, allowing the launching aircraft to guide multiple missiles simultaneously. Semi-active radar homing in mid-course transition to active radar homing in the terminal phase. That active terminal seeker meant the missile could complete its intercept autonomously, freeing the launching F-14 maneuver defensively or engage additional targets. The Phoenix's solid fuel rocket motor burned for approximately 63 seconds, an extraordinarily long burn time for an air-to-air missile. This sustained thrust pushed the missile to maximum velocity and gave it impressive kinetic energy throughout its flight profile. Most missiles have much shorter burn times, maybe 5 to 10 seconds, and then coast for the rest of their flight. Leading energy, Phoenix's extended burn meant it maintained high speed and energy, even at extreme ranges. Iraqi fighters carried Soviet air-to-air missiles that operated on entirely different principles, reflecting different design philosophies and technological capabilities. The R-60 Aphid, Iraq's most common infrared-guided missile, used infrared guidance throughout its flight. The missile homed on the target's heat signature, particularly engine exhaust. This guidance method had distinct advantages in terms of resistance to radar jamming. You can't jam a heat-seeking missile with radar countermeasures. The R-60 was also relatively simple and reliable, important qualities for weapons that might sit in inventory for years before use. But infrared guidance imposed severe range limitations. The R-60's effective launch envelope rarely exceeded 4 to 5 kilometers. An optimal employment required a rear aspect shot where the target's engine exhaust was clearly visible to the missile seeker. Iraqi pilots had to maneuver their aircraft into positions directly behind their targets within visual range to employ their most reliable weapons effectively. This put them in the most vulnerable position possible close to the enemy. Predictable flight path, low energy state from maneuvering. The R-23 Apex represented Iraq's longest-range air-to-air missile during most of the war. In optimal conditions, the R-23 could engage targets at perhaps 35 to 40 kilometers. But that maximum range figure assumed perfect conditions, a non-maneuvering target, optimal altitude and speed, no countermeasures, and a pilot capable of maintaining precise radar lock throughout the missile's flight time. In real combat, achieving those conditions proved incredibly difficult. Maintaining radar lock on a maneuvering target at 35 kilometers while flying a fighter aircraft subjected to combat stress, possible surface-to-air missile threats, and the need for defensive maneuvering tested even experienced pilots. The cognitive workload was immense. Fly the aircraft, maintain formation if applicable, scan for threats, manage the radar. Keep the target in the radar's tracking gate despite its maneuvers, monitor fuel state, and be ready to react to threats. Doing all of this while your radar warning receiver might be screaming about threats your own radar can't detect pushed pilots to their limits. The tactical implications of this missile disparity extended beyond simple range comparisons. With Phoenix missiles, Iranian F-14 crews could employ what's called a shoot-on desist doctrine. Fire missiles at maximum range against multiple targets, evaluate results, and decide whether follow-on shots are necessary while maintaining positional advantage. They could launch from positions of safety, observe the results, and adapt their tactics based on what happened. If the first salvo succeeded, great. If not, they had time and space to set up additional shots. With the weapons available to Iraqi pilots, they had to close to within visual range of their targets, usually less than 10 kilometers for reliable employment. They had to achieve specific geometric advantages, like tail aspect positioning for infrared missiles. And they had to maintain those advantages throughout the engagement, while the target was actively maneuvering to defeat the attack. One side could fight from standoff range with multiple engagement options. The other side had to close to knife fighting range and maintain precision tracking under stress. This asymmetry shaped every tactical decision both sides made and created engagement parameters that heavily favored the F-14s. Behind every statistic, every kill, every loss was a human being. A pilot who'd trained for years, who had a family waiting at home, who climbed into that cockpit knowing they might not come back. This isn't a video game. These were real people in real aircraft in real combat. And the technology gap meant that courage often wasn't enough. The MiG-29 represented a generational leap in capability over the MiG-21s and earlier MiG-23 variants Iraq had operated during the Iran-Iraq War. Iraqi investment in French Mirage F-1 fighters, equipped with Super 530 missiles, reflected similar priorities. Acquiring weapon systems with credible beyond visual range engagement capability. These procurement decisions were direct responses to lessons learned fighting F-14s. That Iraqi pilot we met at the beginning, he made it home that day. He broke hard, dove for the deck, and pushed his engines to the limit. The Phoenix missile tracking him lost lock in the ground clutter, detonating harmlessly miles behind him. But he never forgot that feeling, that moment when he realized he was prey, not predator. Never flew another mission where F-14s might be present without that fear gnawing at him. Years later, long after the war ended, he would still wake up at night hearing that radar warning tone in his nightmares. The F-14 Tomcat proved something that day, something that echoes in every fighter cockpit from Washington to Moscow to Beijing. In modern air combat, the first look is the first kill. The side that sees farthest, shoots farthest, and thinks farthest wins, regardless of speed, regardless of agility, regardless of courage. The specific moment when Iraqi MiG pilots detected F-1 for radar emissions at impossible ranges is that instant of recognition that something was hunting them from beyond their ability to respond, represents a pivotal point in military aviation history. It marks the transition from an era where fighter combat was primarily about aircraft performance, maneuverability, and pilot skill, to an era where sensors, weapons range, and systems integration became the decisive factors. The age of the gunfighter gave way to the age of the systems operator. The lessons learned when Iraqi pilots heard that a WG-9 tone at 100 miles range and knew they had perhaps 60 seconds to react before a Phoenix missile ended their lives, those lessons continue shaping how air forces train, how they design fighters, and how they plan for air combat today. That truth, written in contrails and tragedy above the Persian Gulf between 1980 and 1988, remains as valid today as it was then. Perhaps even more so, as sensor technology continues advancing faster than airframe performance can match. The ghost is still hunting. You just can't see it until it's too late.